Every year, hundreds vanish at sea, not from storms, not from shipwrecks, but from something far stranger. Welcome to Night Souls, where the ocean keeps its darkest secrets. Tonight we're diving into true horror from the deep blue. Real accounts from passengers and crew who witnessed the unexplainable. Shadowy figures on empty decks, SOS signals from ships that don't exist, and voices echoing from beneath the waves. But here's the part most people don't know. Some of these stories were never meant to be heard. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the sea isn't always silent, and why some who travel it never truly come back. If you dare to stay until the end, you'll hear one account so disturbing it was buried in maritime records for decades. Let's begin. My husband Ben and I saved for 2 years for our 10th anniversary cruise. The brochures sold a dream. 7 days of azure seas, white sand beaches, and 5-star service aboard the Ocean Radiance. We were giddy with anticipation, meticulously planning our excursions and packing our finest clothes. We were teachers, living a life of moderate means, and this was our splurge, our once-in-a-decade escape from grading papers and parent-teacher conferences. To afford the trip, we'd made one significant compromise: an interior stateroom. Who needs a window? We'd reasoned, laughing. We'll only be in there to sleep and change. We'll be out living the dream. Cabin 741 was small but efficient. A cozy box with a queen bed, a tiny ensuite bathroom, and a clever arrangement of mirrors that made it feel less like a closet. The lack of a porthole was its defining feature, creating a perfect, absolute darkness when the lights were out. Something we initially celebrated as a guarantee of the best sleep of our lives. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We danced under the stars, ate until we were delightfully stuffed, and toasted our life together with overpriced cocktails. We'd collapse into bed each night, exhausted and happy, the gentle rock of the ship lulling us into a deep, dreamless slumber. It began on the 3rd night. I've always been a light sleeper. A car door slamming outside our house at night is enough to pull me from sleep. So when I woke up around 3 a.m., I wasn't immediately alarmed. The ship was quiet, the constant low thrum of the engines a familiar comfort. The darkness in the room was profound, a velvet blackness so complete it felt like a physical weight on my eyes. It was a feeling that woke me. A prickle on the back of my neck, the primitive gut-deep sensation of being watched. I lay perfectly still, listening. Ben was asleep beside me, his breathing slow and steady. The air conditioner whirred softly. Nothing else. "You're being silly, Sarah," I told myself. "It's a new place. You're just disoriented." I closed my eyes, trying to will myself back to sleep. But the feeling wouldn't subside. It intensified. It felt like a pressure in the room, a silent, static presence that was focusing on me. My skin began to crawl. I needed light. I needed to break the spell of the darkness. My phone was on the nightstand. I slowly, carefully, reached for it, my movements hesitant, as if I were afraid of disturbing whatever else might be in the room. My fingers found the cool, smooth glass. I fumbled for the side button and pressed it. The screen lit up with a soft blue-white glow. I didn't point it anywhere, just held it, letting my eyes adjust to the sudden light. The feeling of being watched was now a certainty. It was emanating from the foot of the bed. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I slowly angled the phone, directing its dim light toward the end of the room. And I saw him. A man was standing at the foot of our bed. He was tall and gaunt, his frame lost in clothes that seemed from another era. A tattered, once white linen suit that was now a dirty grey, hanging loosely from his bony shoulders. His posture was unnaturally still, his arms hanging limp at his sides. But he wasn't looking at me. His head was tilted, his gaze fixed on Ben's sleeping form. My breath caught in my throat, every muscle in my body locked. This wasn't a crew member, this wasn't a confused passenger. There was an aura of profound wrongness about him, a stillness that wasn't human. The air around him seemed colder. My mind raced, a frantic, silent scream. How did he get in? The door is locked, bolted from the inside. As if sensing my terror, his head began to turn. It was a slow, deliberate, mechanical motion, the kind you see in bad horror movies. It wasn't the fluid movement of a living person. Inch by inch, his face came into view. He had no discernible features. Not really. His skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over his skull. But where his eyes should have been were two pools of absolute blackness, voids that seemed to absorb the light from my phone. There was no nose, just two slits, and his mouth was a thin, grim line. Those black eyes locked onto mine. A sound escaped my lips then, a choked, guttural gasp. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The moment the sound left me, I moved. Adrenaline flooded my system, overriding my paralysis. I scrambled backward in the bed, my back hitting the headboard with a thud, my free hand flailing for the bedside lamp. My fingers found the switch, a cheap plastic nub, and I clawed at it. Click. The room was suddenly, brutally, flooded with the warm, yellow light of the lamp. I blinked, my eyes stinging. The foot of the bed was empty. The man was gone. Ben jolted awake beside me. "Sarah? What? What is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. I couldn't speak. I was hyperventilating, pointing a trembling finger at the empty space where the man had been. Tears started to stream down my face. "Sarah, talk to me. Are you okay? Did you have a nightmare?" He was there. I finally stammered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. A man, at the foot of the bed. Ben was instantly alert. He threw the covers off and jumped out of bed, his own fear now evident. He checked the small bathroom, the closet, even looked under the bed. He went to the cabin door and checked the bolt. It was still securely locked from the inside. "There's no one here, honey," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He came back to the bed and held me. "You must have had a night terror. It happens. The dark room, the strange bed. Your brain was just playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him, but I saw him. I felt the cold emanating from him. I saw those black, light-swallowing eyes. "It wasn't a dream, Ben." I whispered into his chest. I was awake. I saw him. He held me until my shaking subsided, but I could feel his skepticism. He was a science teacher, a man of logic and reason. Ghosts weren't in his curriculum. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We left the lights on and sat in silence, watching the empty space at the foot of our bed. The cozy cabin now felt like a trap. The next morning, bleary-eyed and frayed, I insisted we go to the guest services desk. The woman behind the counter, her smile polished and professional, listened to my story with a practiced, patient expression. "I understand, ma'am," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It can be disorienting, the first few nights in an interior room. It was almost certainly a hypnopompic hallucination, very common. The brain wakes up before the body, and you can see dream images superimposed on the real world." She was reciting from a manual. I could tell. "Can you at least check your records?" I pleaded, feeling desperate and foolish. "Has anyone else ever reported anything strange in that cabin?" Her smile tightened. "I can assure you, cabin 741 has an impeccable record. Now, would you like me to see if we have any ocean view staterooms available for an upgrade? There would, of course, be a fee." It was a dismissal. She was offering to solve our problem for several $100 more. We declined. We were teachers, after all. Defeated, we spent the day in a fog. The magic of the cruise was gone, replaced by a low-grade, constant anxiety. The sun was too bright, the music too loud. All I could think about was the coming night. That evening, we decided to have a drink at one of the ship's many bars, hoping to calm our nerves. We found a quiet corner and ordered 2 glasses of wine. The bartender was an older man with a kind, weathered face and eyes that had seen countless passengers come and go. He noticed our somber mood. "Rough day at sea?" he asked, polishing a glass. Ben gave a non-committal grunt. I, emboldened by the wine and my desperation, decided to try one more time. "Has anyone ever mentioned anything unusual about cabin 741? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The bartender stopped polishing. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second the professional mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not fear, but a deep, weary knowledge. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in close. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, his voice low, and the company would have my head for saying it. "But that cabin, it has a history." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What history?" "It was back in the 50s, he said. "This ship had a different name then, the SS Atlantica. A man, a wealthy socialite from New York, was traveling to Europe. He was running from something, debts, a scandal, no one knows for sure. He hid in that cabin for the entire crossing, paid off a steward to bring him food, never showed his face. When the ship docked in Southampton, the steward went to get him and found him dead. He'd starved to death. The official story was illness, but the crew knew. He'd been too afraid to leave, even to eat. He just wasted away in that little windowless room. The air left my lungs. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The gaunt frame, the tattered, old-fashioned clothes, the feeling of profound loneliness and despair that had radiated from him. He wasn't looking at Ben with malice. He was looking with a kind of hollow envy. Ben was alive. He was warm. He had someone. He was the stowaway. Not a stowaway hiding from the authorities, but a soul hiding from life itself, and now trapped forever in the dark box where he'd died. We didn't go back to cabin 741 that night. We couldn't. We spent a small fortune to upgrade to a suite with a balcony, and even then we slept with every light on. The rest of the cruise was a write-off. We were just counting down the hours until we could get off that ship. When we finally disembarked, the solid ground of the pier felt like a miracle. I never got a full refund. I never even got an apology. The cruise line's official stance remained that I had suffered a non-specific anxiety episode. But I know what I saw. Ben, to his credit, never again called it a nightmare. He saw the change in me. He felt the icy dread that clung to me for weeks afterward. We still have the photos from that cruise. We're smiling in them, our arms around each other, with the perfect blue sea in the background. But if you look closely at my eyes, you can see it. A shadow. The memory of a gaunt man in a linen suit standing in the perfect dark, a permanent passenger on a voyage that never ends. A stowaway in his own private hell who, for one terrifying moment, decided to share it with us. My name is Chloe, and for 8 months the sovereign of the seas was my entire world. By day, she was a floating carnival, a chaos of splashing children, clinking glasses, and the thumping bass of the poolside DJ. But from midnight to 8 a.m., she was mine, my domain, my quiet, lonely kingdom. I was a cleaner for the hospitality staff, part of the invisible army that scrubbed away the evidence of the day's revelry. My main assignment was the Lido deck, the ship's vibrant heart during the day. By night, it was a ghost town of stacked deck chairs, empty bars, and the 3 massive swimming pools. Their water still and dark under the star-dusted sky. The rules for the pools were non-negotiable. For safety and hygiene, they had to be drained and scrubbed every single night. No exceptions. It was a strange, almost sacred ritual. The powerful pumps would groan to life, and the water would vanish, leaving behind vast blue-tiled pits that echoed with a profound silence. My job was to get in there with a long-handled brush and industrial disinfectant, scrubbing away the invisible film of sunscreen, sweat, and the day's forgotten joys. I didn't mind the work. I liked the solitude. I'd put in my earbuds, listen to my podcasts, and lose myself in the rhythmic, mindless motion of cleaning. The only light came from the moon and the dim, safety LEDs around the deck, casting long, dancing shadows. It was peaceful. That changed on a night we were sailing through the Bermuda Triangle. Not that I believe in that stuff, but the crew gossip was ripe with stories of compasses going haywire and strange lights in the sky. The air felt different that night, thicker, heavier, and unnaturally still. The sea was a sheet of black glass, reflecting no light, as if the stars themselves were afraid to look down. I was on my third and final pool, the main one at the center of the deck. It was the largest, with a deep end that plunged down over 12 feet. I had just finished scrubbing the shallow end and was about to climb out to start the refill process when I heard it. A giggle. It was a child's laugh, clear, high-pitched, and full of delight. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of a small body splashing in water. My blood went cold. I ripped out my earbuds, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. The deck was empty. The chairs were stacked. The pools were bone dry. I was completely alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and brittle against the vastness of the ocean. "The pool is closed. You can't be up here." The giggling stopped. The silence that rushed back in was even more oppressive than before. I stood frozen in the empty pool, my brush held like a weapon, my heart thudding against my ribs. It was the wind, I told myself, my knuckles white around the brush handle. Or a trick of the water in the pipes. Maybe it came from an open balcony below. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. I was being ridiculous. I had a job to finish. I turned to climb the ladder out of the pool. Splash. Giggle. This time it was right behind me. I spun around so fast I almost lost my footing on the wet tiles. The deep end of the pool was still shrouded in shadow, a black maw at the far end of the blue-tiled pit. The sound had come from there, from the absolute emptiness. Then the giggling started again. But it wasn't joyful anymore. It was different, it was closer, and it had a mocking, almost teasing quality to it. It wasn't coming from one spot anymore. It seemed to drift around me, circling the empty pool. Fear, sharp and acidic, rose in my throat. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't the wind. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "This isn't funny." The giggling stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only the gentle hum of the ship and the frantic pulse in my ears. And then I felt it. A cold, fine mist sprayed against the back of my neck as if someone had just flicked wet fingers at me. That was it. That was the end. A scream tore from my lungs, raw and primal. I dropped the brush with a clatter and scrambled up the pool ladder, my wet shoes slipping on the rungs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I hit the deck and ran. I didn't stop to get my cleaning cart. I didn't stop to log out. I just ran, my footsteps echoing through the deserted lounge, through the silent corridors, until I burst into the bright, harshly lit crew quarters, gasping for air. The security team found me 20 minutes later, huddled in a corner of the mess hall, still shaking. They were skeptical, of course. They did a sweep of the Lido deck. They found my cleaning cart. They found the brush lying in the dry pool. They found nothing else. My supervisor, a pragmatic woman named Ingrid, listened to my hysterical story with a tired expression. "Chloe, you were alone on a dark deck. Your mind can play tricks. You probably heard a seal breaking on a ketchup bottle from the galley vent. The mist was probably just a bit of sea spray." But she hadn't been there. She hadn't heard the way that giggle seemed to crawl inside my head. She hadn't felt that specific, targeted coldness on her skin. They put me on laundry duty for the rest of the voyage. I didn't argue. I never set foot on the Lido deck after dark again. On the final morning of the cruise, as the ship docked in Miami, I had to collect my final paycheck from the hospitality office, which required crossing the Lido deck one last time. It was 7 a.m., and the deck was still mostly empty, the pools full and clean, waiting for the day's first swimmers. I walked quickly, my eyes fixed straight ahead, determined not to look at the main pool. But as I passed it, something made me stop. Something on the deck, right next to the deep end. It was a single, small, wet footprint. It was a child's footprint, perfectly defined against the dry, clean deck. Water was still beaded around its edges, meaning it was fresh. But there was no child, no wet trail leading away. It was just there. A lone, small footprint, pointing toward the deep blue water. I never went back to see. I work in a hotel now, on the 15th floor of a building in Phoenix, as far from the ocean as I can get. But sometimes, when I'm cleaning a bathtub or hear a child laughing in the hallway, I freeze. I remember the empty, blue-tiled pit, the drifting, mocking giggle and the cold mist on my neck. And I know, with a certainty that chills me, that I wasn't alone on the deck that night. There was something in that empty pool with me. Something that found my solitude amusing. Something that still plays in the midnight water, waiting for a new friend to join its game. My job was the bridge between the ship and the shore. As part of the shore excursions team on the Pacific Dawn, I was the one herding cats, smiling, sun-hatted, slightly anxious cats, from the gangway onto waiting tenders and tour buses. I knew the rhythm of a port day like a drill sergeant. The early morning chaos, the long hot lines, the relief when the last passenger was safely accounted for and we could cast off. The incident happened in a small, lush Caribbean port. The air was thick with the smell of salt, frangipani, and diesel from the idling tenders. We were running behind schedule. A squall had delayed the first wave of returns, and the line to reboard the ship snaked across the sweltering concrete pier, a restless, sunburned serpent of humanity. I was at the head of the line, just before the gangway, scanning cruise cards with a fixed professional smile, my voice a constant cheerful refrain. "Welcome back. Watch your step." That's when I saw him. About 15 people back in the line, standing perfectly still amidst the shifting, impatient crowd. He was a tall, thin man, dressed not in bright vacation clothes, but in a dark, heavy-looking wool suit, utterly inappropriate for the tropical heat. His face was pale and gaunt, and he wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a deep shadow over his features. He carried a small, old-fashioned leather doctor's bag. What struck me most was his stillness. While everyone around him fanned themselves, checked their watches, and shuffled forward, he was a statue. He didn't speak to anyone. He just stared straight ahead, at the ship, with an intensity that felt hungry. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I'd seen thousands of passengers, but never one like him. He didn't fit. My radio crackled. "Anya, we need to speed this up. The captain wants to make up time." "Copy that," I replied, forcing my eyes away from the strange man. I focused on my task, scanning cards, my smile feeling more brittle by the second. Shuffle, scan, beep. "Welcome back." Shuffle, scan, beep. "Welcome back." The line moved forward. He was 10 people away now. I could see his hands. They were long and pale, clutching the handle of his bag. They looked waxy, almost unreal. My heart began to beat a little faster. There was something profoundly wrong here. I keyed my radio, speaking low. "Security, this is Anya at the main gangway. I have a passenger of concern, male, dark suit, near the front of the line." "Description noted, Anya. We'll keep an eye out." 5 people away. The family in front of him handed me their cards. I scanned them mechanically, my eyes locked on the man. As the family moved past me onto the gangway, he took a single, smooth step forward, now first in line. He stood before me. Up close, the wrongness was overwhelming. The wool of his suit smelled faintly of dust and camphor, like a trunk opened after a century. The shadow under his hat was impenetrable, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and assessing. He did not offer a cruise card. "Sir," I said, my voice tighter than I intended, "I need to scan your card." He didn't move, didn't speak. "Sir, your boarding pass, please." Slowly, one of those pale, waxy hands came up, but it didn't reach for a wallet or a lanyard. It moved toward my face as if to brush a strand of hair from my cheek. I flinched backward, a small, involuntary gasp escaping my lips. "Don't touch me!" At that moment, a burly security officer, Mike, arrived at my shoulder. "Everything all right here, Anya?" The man's hand froze in midair. His head tilted slightly, the shadowed gaze shifting from me to Mike. He seemed to weigh the new variable. Then, without a word, he simply turned. He didn't walk back down the line. He stepped sideways away from the queue and seemed to melt into the crowd of passengers still milling about the pier. 1 second he was there, a stark black figure against the bright, colorful backdrop. The next, he was gone, vanished. Mike and I scanned the pier frantically. Nothing. "We've got a runner," Mike said into his radio, his voice grim. "Male, dark suit, no ID, sweep the pier." They never found him. The ship's manifest was meticulously checked. Every single passenger and crew member was accounted for. There was no record of a man matching that description ever boarding the Pacific Dawn in the first place. The official report called it a local attempting to board illegally who got spooked and fled. But they didn't see his hands. They didn't smell the dust on his suit. They didn't feel the predatory stillness that radiated from him. I transferred to a desk job in the corporate offices after that. I couldn't stand the gangway anymore. To this day, I have nightmares about that line. I see his pale hand reaching for me, and I wake up gasping. I don't know who or what he was. A ghost from a time of ocean liners and steamer trunks? Something else that found its way into our world from a darker port of call? All I know is that he wasn't on the manifest. He wasn't supposed to be there, and he wasn't trying to sneak on for a free ride. He was looking for something. And for a terrifying moment, standing alone at the head of that line, I felt like I was it. My name is David, and I am a man of maps. As a civil engineer, my world is one of precise measurements, grid lines, and logical, predictable structures. The Oceanus Majesty, for all its grandeur, was just another structure to me. A complex one, certainly, but one that obeyed the laws of physics and could be understood with a good deck plan. I'd studied it for weeks before our family vacation, memorizing the quickest routes from our stateroom to the pools, the theaters, the restaurants. I prided myself on my sense of direction. The incident happened on the third night. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids were exhausted from a day in the sun and had turned in early. Feeling restless, I decided to take a walk and explore one of the upper decks I hadn't yet visited. I was looking for the Starlight Lounge, which the Daily Planner promised had a jazz quartet playing until midnight. I took a wrong turn. A simple, foolish error. I meant to take a staircase up to deck 12, but I accidentally pushed through an unmarked, heavy door that led down. The atmosphere changed instantly. The plush carpets and polished brass of the passenger areas gave way to linoleum floors and painted steel walls. The air grew noticeably cooler and carried the faint industrial scent of oil and cleaning solution. I was on a crew deck. No matter, I thought, consulting the small map on my phone. I'll just find the next staircase up. But the corridor I was in wasn't on the map. It was a long, featureless hallway, poorly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes spaced too far apart. The doors were all identical, heavy and grey, each marked with a number, 107, 108. There were no signs, no decorative plants, no indicators of where anything was. Just the endless repeating numbers and the low hum of machinery that seemed to vibrate through the floor. I started walking, confident I'd find a junction or a stairwell. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes. The corridor stretched ahead, a perfect receding perspective of doors and flickering lights. 107, 108, 107, 108. I checked the numbers on the doors. They were repeating. I was passing the same 2 doors over and over. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. Impossible. You're just disoriented. I picked up my pace. The linoleum echoed under my shoes, the sound seeming to be swallowed by the oppressive silence between the hums. 107, 108, 107, 108. I started to run, a slow jog at first, then a full-on sprint. My heart began to hammer in my chest. The corridor stretched on, unchanging, an infinite loop of gray doors and bad lighting. The air grew colder. The hum of the ship's engines, ever present in the passenger areas, had faded to a distant, almost imperceptible whisper, as if this place existed outside the ship itself. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. This defied logic. This defied physics. I was a rational man, and I was trapped in an impossible space. I stopped running, leaning against a door marked 108, gasping for breath. My phone had no signal. The digital clock on the screen was frozen. That's when I saw him. At the very far end of the corridor, so far he was just a silhouette, was a figure in a crewman's uniform. Relief, so potent it made me weak, flooded through me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. "Hey, I'm lost. Can you help me?" The figure turned. He was too far away to see his face, but I could see his posture. He was rigid, tense. I started walking toward him, then breaking into a run again. "Wait, please!" As I got closer, I could see his face more clearly. He was a young man, his eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't surprise. It was sheer, unadulterated terror. He held a single finger to his lips in a universal, frantic gesture for silence. His eyes darted past me, down the corridor I had just come from, as if he saw something terrible approaching. Then, without a sound, he fumbled with a keycard, shoved open door 107 and slipped inside. I heard the distinct, solid thunk of a heavy bolt being thrown. I stood there frozen in disbelief. He had seen me. He had looked right at me, a lost, clearly distressed passenger, and he had fled in terror and locked himself away. The cold in the corridor seemed to intensify, seeping through my clothes. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a listening, waiting thing. The flickering lights seemed to strobe, casting jumping shadows that now felt menacing. I didn't call out again. The crewman's fear was contagious, a virus that had infected my own soul. I turned and ran back the way I had come, driven by a primal need to escape that endless repeating space. I didn't look at the doors. I just ran, my lungs burning, expecting at any moment to feel a cold hand on my shoulder. I have no memory of how I finally escaped. One moment I was sprinting down that featureless hall, the next I stumbled through a heavy door and found myself back in the warm, noisy and blessedly familiar surroundings of the main promenade on Deck 7. People were laughing, drinking, shopping. It was like waking from a nightmare. I stood there, leaning against a pillar, trying to calm my racing heart. I was drenched in a cold sweat. I never told my family. What would I say? That Daddy got lost in a scary hallway? They'd have laughed. The next day, feigning casual curiosity, I went to the guest services desk and asked for a full deck plan, including crew areas. The woman looked at me strangely but provided a schematic. I pored over it. There was no endless corridor. According to the plans, the area where I'd been was a compact block of crew cabins and a small laundry facility. A finite, measurable space. I sought out the crewman for days, scanning every face, but I never saw him again. Maybe he was on a different shift. Or maybe he, like me, was trying to forget the impossible geometry of that hallway. I am a man of logic. I deal in concrete and steel, in forces that can be calculated and predicted. but I cannot explain what happened to me on Deck 11 of the Oceanus Majesty. I encountered a place that should not exist, a glitch in the reality of that floating city. And the most terrifying part wasn't the endlessness itself. It was the look on that crewman's face. A look that said he knew exactly what was in that corridor with us, and that locking the door was his only hope of survival. I didn't see what he saw, but I felt its presence in the growing cold and the listening silence, and sometimes, in my dreams, I'm still there, running past doors 107 and 108 forever. My name is Mark Rinaldi, and for 3 years I called the MS Celestial Odyssey my home and workplace. She was a floating city, a leviathan of steel and glass that carried 3,000 souls across the Caribbean. To the passengers on the upper decks, she was a paradise of buffets, pools, and endless entertainment. But for me and the rest of the engineering crew, her heart was deep below the waterline, in a world of roaring machinery, sweat, and the ever-present oily scent of industry. The engine room was my cathedral, a vast multi-story cavern throbbing with the power of the ship's diesel-electric engines. The air was a thick cocktail of heat, humidity, and the tang of fuel. The noise was a physical presence, a deep, constant bass note that vibrated in your teeth and bones, so loud that you learned to read lips and communicate with hand signals. I was a technician, a grease monkey. My job was to keep the heart of this beast beating, to trace the veins of electrical conduits and hydraulic lines, to listen for the slightest cough or sputter in its mechanical symphony. But beneath even this sanctum of industry lay the ship's underworld, the bilge. If the engine room was the heart, the bilge was the ship's colon. It was the lowest point, a labyrinthine space between the inner and outer hulls, where all the ship's waste fluids eventually drained, a foul cocktail of seawater, oil, grease, and God knows what else from the hundreds of cabins and galleys above. It was a place of perpetual dampness, darkness, and a smell that clung to your clothes and your sinuses for days, a mix of stale salt, rotting organic matter, and heavy chemical lubricants. We had a rotation for bilge checks. No one liked it. It was a mandatory, twice-daily descent into a place that felt fundamentally wrong. The access was through heavy, watertight hatches located in the most remote corners of the engine room, their rungs leading down into a claustrophobic darkness that our powerful work lights could never fully penetrate. The first time I went down, my trainer, a grizzled old Scotsman named Dougie, who'd been at sea for 40 years, had clapped me on the shoulder. "Remember, lad," he'd shouted over the engine drone, "down there, you're not at the top of the food chain. Just do your checks and get out. Don't linger. And for Christ's sake, mind your footing." I'd laughed it off then, assuming it was just hazing for the new guy. But there was a look in his eyes, a seriousness that didn't match his usual crass humor. That was 3 years ago. I'd done my bilge checks without incident, growing complacent in the routine dread of the place. The fear became mundane, just another part of the job, like the risk of a steam burn or an electrical shock. That all changed on the Odyssey's final voyage before her scheduled dry dock. We were 2 days out from Fort Lauderdale, cruising through the deep, dark waters north of the Bahamas. It was my shift, the graveyard, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The ship was quiet, most passengers asleep. The night's revelry faded to a distant memory. Down in the engine room, the watch was calm. The chief engineer was in his office doing paperwork, and it was just me and another tech, a young guy named Leo, doing rounds. At 2:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on the control panel, my handheld radio crackled. It was the chief. "Rinaldi, we're getting a pressure spike reading on the forward starboard bilge pump. The sensor's reading a possible blockage. I need you to go down and do a visual, probably just a rag or some debris." A groan echoed in my head, but my voice was professional. "Copy that, Chief. On my way." Leo gave me a sympathetic look from across the catwalk. "Want me to come with you?" he mouthed. I shook my head. It was a one-man job, and frankly, having someone else down there just meant twice the anxiety. I'm good back in 20. I collected my gear, a heavy-duty, intrinsically safe flashlight, the kind that wouldn't spark and ignite any fumes, a wrench, a poker for clearing blockages, and my radio. I clipped the flashlight to my belt, took a deep breath of the relatively clean engine room air, and headed for the forward starboard access hatch. The hatch was located in a dimly lit alcove, away from the main machinery. The metal was cold and beaded with condensation. I undogged the heavy locking wheel, the sound of grinding metal loud even over the engine hum. The hatch swung inward, revealing a yawning black square in the deck. A wave of that familiar foul odor, colder and denser here, wafted up, making my eyes water. I shone my light down. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the steel rungs of the ladder descending into the abyss. Below, I could see the faint sheen of stagnant water, maybe a foot deep, sloshing gently with the ship's roll. I started my descent, the cold metal of the rungs biting through my work gloves. The temperature dropped a good 20 degrees as I climbed down. The sound of the engines became muffled, replaced by the drip, drip, drip of water from 1,000 different sources and the soft, rhythmic lap of water against steel. My boots hit the water with a thick splash. I was in. The bilge was a forest of steel. Massive I-beams, conduits, and pipes of all diameters ran in every direction, coated in a slimy black grime. My flashlight beam was a frantic dancer in the darkness, jumping from one obstacle to the next, creating long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The ceiling was low, forcing me to stoop in most places. I started making my way forward toward the starboard pump intake, my boots making sucking sounds with every step. The plan was simple: find the pump, clear the blockage if I could, report back. But the Celestial Odyssey was old, and her bilge was a tangled mess, a testament to decades of repairs and additions. The path I usually took was partially blocked by a newly installed bundle of fiber optic cables, forcing me to take a less familiar route, ducking under a low-hanging pipe into a narrower section I hadn't visited in months. It was here that things began to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was different. Underneath the usual cocktail of oil and decay was a new, sharper scent. It was metallic, coppery, like the smell of blood, but mixed with something else, something profoundly rotten, like a fishing net full of catch left to bake in the sun for a week. I paused, shining my light around. The water here seemed murkier, with a faint, iridescent sheen to it, like a oil slick. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It's just your mind, Mark. You're tired. It's the graveyard shift. You're spooking yourself. I pressed on, my footsteps slower, more deliberate. Then I heard it. It was a soft, wet sound, distinct from the dripping and the lapping. A slosh, drag, slosh, drag. Like something heavy and wet was being pulled through the water somewhere ahead of me, around a corner formed by a bulkhead. My blood ran cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and pathetic in the cavernous space. "Leo, that you?" The sound stopped instantly. Silence. Thick, heavy silence, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam trained on the corner, my hand tightening around the metal poker. It's just water shifting in a tank, its pipes contracting. It's anything but what it sounds like. I forced my legs to move, taking one cautious step, then another. I had to get to that pump. I had to complete my check and get the hell out. As I rounded the corner, the smell hit me with the force of a physical blow. The metallic, rotten stench was overpowering here, so strong I gagged, pulling the neck of my shirt up over my nose. My light swept the new section. It was a dead end, a small chamber where several large pipes converged before disappearing through the hull. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the starboard bilge pump intake, a grated opening about 2 feet across. But my attention wasn't on the pump. Lying on a slightly raised, dry-ish patch of steel plating was something that made my stomach lurch. It was a fish, a large mahi-mahi, or what was left of one, but it wasn't just dead. It was liquefied. Its skin was split open, not from bites, but as if from some immense internal pressure. Its insides a gray, viscous slurry, and it was covered in the same iridescent, oily slime I'd seen in the water. What kind of bacteria could do that? And how did a fresh fish get down here? That's when my flashlight died. Not a gradual dimming. It was as if someone had thrown a switch. 1 second I was staring at the horrific fish. The next, I was plunged into a blackness so absolute it felt solid. I was blind. The silence was now total, the dripping and lapping sounds seemingly swallowed by the darkness. Panic, pure and electric, shot through me. I fumbled frantically at my belt for my backup light, a smaller but powerful pen light. My gloves made me clumsy. I dropped it. The sound of the plastic hitting the steel deck and skittering away was terrifyingly loud. Slosh. Drag. The sound was back. Closer. Much closer. It was just on the other side of the chamber, maybe 10 feet from me. I could hear the water displacing as something moved through it. I could hear a wet, rhythmic breathing now, a gurgling inhalation and exhalation. I fell to my knees, my hands scrambling through the foul water, feeling for my penlight. My fingers brushed against slime, against bits of unidentifiable debris. Where is it? Where is it? Slosh. Drag. It was in the chamber with me now. I could feel a displacement in the air, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. The rotten, coppery smell was so thick I could taste it at the back of my throat, metallic and foul. My fingers closed around the cylindrical shape of the pen light. I snatched it up, my thumb finding the switch. I pointed it in the direction of the sound and clicked it on. The beam was weak compared to my main light, but in the utter blackness, it was a lighthouse. It illuminated the thing for less than a second, but that image is burned into my memory forever. It was pale, a sickly grey-white, like the underbelly of a deep-sea fish. It had no discernible head, just a rounded bulbous mass that tapered into a thick, slug-like torso. Its skin was glistening, covered in the same iridescent slime, and it seemed to pulse rhythmically. But it was the appendages that haunt me. It had several of them, long, boneless tentacles or arms that dragged behind it through the water, and it was using 2 others to pull its bulk forward. And right in the center of its mass, where a face might be, was a vertical, lipless gash that was opening and closing, from which that wet, gurgling breath came. It was maybe 8 feet long, and it was between me and the only way out. Our eyes met. It had no eyes, not as we know them, but I felt its attention lock onto me. I felt a wave of primal, ancient malevolence radiate from it, a hunger that was as old as the deep ocean itself. I screamed. I don't know what I screamed, probably just a raw, unfiltered sound of terror. The thing recoiled slightly from the noise, its mouth gaping wider, letting out a hissing gurgle. That was my chance. I scrambled backward, not caring about the water, the filth, anything. I turned and ran, or rather, I stumbled, hunched over, crashing into pipes, feeling sharp edges tear at my coveralls and skin. I didn't look back. I could hear it behind me, the sloshing and dragging now faster, more frantic, and that hissing gurgle echoing off the steel walls. I found the ladder through sheer panicked luck. I practically flew up the rungs, my muscles screaming. I burst out of the hatch, collapsing onto the engine room deck, gasping and retching. I slammed the heavy hatch shut with a force I didn't know I possessed and spun the locking wheel until it screamed in protest. Leo came running over. "Mark, Jesus, what happened? You're white as a ghost." I couldn't speak. I just pointed a trembling finger at the hatch, my body shaking uncontrollably. The chief emerged from his office. "Rinaldi, report." I finally found my voice. It was a hoarse, broken thing. There's something down there. The chief's face hardened. What kind of something? A leak? A fire? No, I insisted, my voice rising hysterically. A thing, an animal, a monster. It's huge, and it looked at me. Leo looked at the chief, then back at me with pity. The chief sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mark, you've been down there too long. You got spooked. It happens. Probably saw a rat. The ones down there get big on the garbage. This wasn't a rat, I shouted, getting to my feet. It was as big as a man. Bigger. It had arms and it was breathing. The chief placed a firm hand on my shoulder. You're on report, Rinaldi. Go to the infirmary. Get checked out. I think you're suffering from fatigue, maybe some fumes. I was livid, but also defeated. I saw it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. They thought I'd cracked. I spent the rest of the shift in the crew mess, wrapped in a blanket, sipping sweet, terrible coffee, my hands still shaking. The chief sent Leo down with 2 other men to check the pump. They came back 20 minutes later, laughing. Pump was clear, Mark, Leo said, trying to sound reassuring. Just a faulty sensor. We didn't see anything. Place was empty. But the fish, I insisted. There was a decomposed fish. Leo shrugged, saw a few fish bones, probably sucked in through a sea chest. Nothing weird. They hadn't gone down the route I had. They hadn't seen what I saw. The next day, I was called into the chief's office. He was stern but not unkind. Mark, I'm putting you on light duties for the remainder of the voyage. No more bilge work. I need my crew to have a clear head. I was being humored. I was being managed. I tried to forget it. I threw myself into my other duties, but my sleep was plagued by nightmares of glistening pale flesh and that hissing gurgle. I started smelling that coppery rot in my dreams and sometimes waking. On the final night of the cruise, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to prove I wasn't crazy. I waited until my shift was over, until 6 a.m. when the day crew was just starting and the engine room was at its busiest. No one would notice me. I went back to the forward starboard hatch. My heart was a trip hammer in my chest. I undogged the wheel and opened it just a crack, shining my powerful, newly charged flashlight down into the darkness. I didn't see it, but I saw its sign. There, on the steel deck at the bottom of the ladder, clear in the beam of my light, was a trail. A thick, oily, iridescent trail, leading from the direction of that dead-end chamber and disappearing into the deeper darkness of the bilge. It was fresh. And then, from the depths far away but unmistakable, I heard it one last time. Not a slosh or a drag, but that wet, gurgling hiss. It wasn't a sound of pursuit. It sounded almost like laughter. I never set foot on a ship again. I quit the moment we docked in Fort Lauderdale. I gave up my career, my pension, everything. I work in an auto shop now on dry, solid, sun-baked land. Sometimes when I'm under a car in the dim light with the smell of oil and grease around me, I'll hear a drip of water from a leaky pipe, or the scuttle of a rat in the rafters, and my heart will stop. I'll freeze, waiting for the sound of something wet and heavy dragging itself through the shadows. The older crew members had a name for them. Dougie had tried to tell me. They called them bilge rats. But they weren't talking about rodents. They were talking about the things that live in the dark, silent places of the world, the things that climb aboard, unseen and unknown, from the ancient, deep, black water. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my soul, that it's still down there. Somewhere in the labyrinthine gut of the Celestial Odyssey, or perhaps another ship by now, waiting in the darkness, dragging its pale, glistening bulk through the filth, forever hungry. They tell you in the academy that the night watch is a test of discipline. It's 4 hours of profound solitude at the very top of the world, a floating city asleep at your feet, with only the stars and the radar for company. As the most junior officer on the Poseidon's venture, the Iod 0-4-hour watch was my cross to bear. The bridge was my sanctuary. A vast, dark room lit only by the soft green glow of instruments, the gentle sweep of the radar, a digital heartbeat in the silence. Tonight, the sea was a placid black mirror, the sky a clear dome of cold, hard stars. We were 3 days out from Lisbon, cruising through a particularly deep and empty stretch of the Atlantic. The only sounds were the constant low thrum of the engines far below and the quiet hum of the navigation computers. I was making my rounds, checking headings and engine status, the routine as familiar as my own breath. At 03:17 a.m., the ship's internal intercom crackled to life. It shouldn't have. The 1MC, the general announcing system, was only for official ship-wide communications from the bridge. No one else had access, and no one made announcements at 3 a.m. The sound wasn't the usual burst of static before the captain's voice. It was a clean, clear connection, and the voice that came through was not one I recognized. It was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion, like a synthesized voice, but with a chilling human nuance. It recited a string of numbers, a latitude and longitude. My training kicked in before the fear could. My eyes darted to the chart plotter. My fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting the coordinates. The screen zoomed out, then in, pinpointing a location hundreds of miles from our current position in the desolate deep water plains of the mid-Atlantic ridge. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. A drill? I thought frantically. An unannounced safety test. But the chief officer would have briefed me. The captain was asleep. Before I could reach for the radio to call the chief, the intercom clicked on again. The same voice, the same flat tone. "We are waiting," it said. Then a pause, filled only by the hum of the bridge. "The water is cold." The words hung in the air, simple and horrifying. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a mistake. The specificity of the coordinates, the menace in that bland statement, it felt like a broadcast from a ghost ship. My hand, now trembling slightly, snatched the handheld VHF radio. "Chief officer, this is the bridge. Over." A moment of static, then the chief's sleepy voice. "Bridge, go ahead." "Sir, did you just make an announcement on the 1MC, or authorize one?" "Negative, Bridge. It's 3 a.m. What's this about?" My mouth went dry. "Sir, we just had an unsanctioned transmission." A voice recited coordinates in the mid-Atlantic and said they were waiting, that the water was cold. There was a long silence on the other end. I could picture him sitting up in his bunk, the sleep vanishing from his eyes. "Say again, Bridge." I repeated it, my voice tighter this time. "Stand by." The radio went dead. I stood in the center of the bridge, the vast, dark windows feeling less like a view and more like a threat. I was utterly alone, the only conscious soul for decks in every direction, and something had just spoken to me from the heart of the ship. I stared at the coordinates on the screen, a single, meaningless point in 1,000,000 square miles of empty ocean. Who was waiting? 5 minutes later, the chief officer arrived on the bridge, his uniform shirt hastily buttoned, his face grim. The security officer was with him. "Play back the bridge audio log," the chief ordered. I pulled it up. The digital recording was crystal clear. There was my footsteps, the ambient hum. Then, the click of the intercom, and that voice. It was even more chilling the second time. The flat, unfeeling delivery of those terrifying words. "We are waiting. The water is cold." The security officer, a former Marine named Evans, listened with a stony face. He got on the radio and conducted a swift, quiet check of all departments: galley, engineering, hotel services. Every report came back the same. Negative. No transmissions. No drills. The chief turned to me, his expression a mixture of concern and forced professionalism. "It's a malfunction, a glitch in the comms system. Probably picked up a stray radio signal, some numbers station nonsense. The computer interpreted it as an intercom signal." It was a logical explanation, the only logical explanation, but it felt hollow. A stray signal wouldn't have the clarity, the perfect timing, the intentionality of that message. We stood in uneasy silence for a moment, the three of us listening to the ship's normal sounds. And then it happened again. Click. The intercom activated. No static, no warning. This time, the voice was different. It wasn't calm and measured. It was a faint, desperate whisper, strained and close to the microphone, as if someone were hiding in a small, dark space, their lips almost touching the grill. It only said 3 words. Don't look down. Then the connection severed. The bridge was silent once more, but the air was now thick with a palpable dread. The chief and the security officer stared at each other, all pretense of a malfunction gone from their faces. Evans immediately got back on the radio, his voice low and urgent. I want a full physical sweep of the entire intercom relay system. Now. They found nothing. In the port of Lisbon, a team of technicians swarmed the Poseidon's venture. They tested every component, every wire, every microphone. They found no faults, no shorts, no crossed signals. The official report was filed under unexplained audio anomaly. I was relieved of my night watch duties for the rest of the voyage. They said it was to avoid fatigue. But I saw the look in the chief's eyes. He didn't believe it was a glitch either. To this day, I don't know what spoke to me from the intercom that night. Was it a ghost in the machine? A signal from something lost and waiting on the ocean floor? Or something else? Something that knew our position, knew we were alone, and wanted to remind us of the cold, dark, waiting depths just beneath our thin steel hull. I still serve at sea, but I never took another night watch. And sometimes, when I'm on the bridge during a quiet day, I'll glance at the intercom panel, and a cold shiver will trace my spine. I remember that whisper, a warning from the void, and I never, ever looked down. My name is Antonio, and for 5 years my world was the galley of the grandeur of the waves. It was a universe of stainless steel, blistering heat and controlled chaos. We were a brigade, a military unit fighting a daily war against time and expectation, serving 3,000 meals a day with precision and flair. I was a sous chef, second in command of a kitchen that never slept. The heart of our operation, and my personal domain, was the garde-manger section, cold appetizers, salads, desserts. And the throne room of my domain was the walk-in freezer. It was a colossal humming vault, a place of stark order and sub-zero temperatures. Stepping inside was like entering another dimension. The roar of the ship faded, replaced by the deep mechanical thrum of the compressors. The air was a solid, crystalline cold that bit through my chef's whites in seconds. Racks upon racks of frozen goods stretched from floor to ceiling. Sides of beef glazed in frost, cases of frozen lobster tails, towers of pre-portioned fish fillets, all gleaming under the harsh, fluorescent light. I knew its every hum, its every rattle. I knew that the door, a heavy sealed unit with a thick rubber gasket, could only be opened from the outside if the internal safety release was disengaged. It was a fundamental rule, drilled into every new crew member: never, ever block the door, and always make sure someone knows you're going in. It happened during the final dinner service of a transatlantic crossing. We were preparing for the captain's gala, the culinary climax of the voyage. We were short-staffed. 2 of my commis chefs were down with a norovirus that was ripping through the crew quarters. The pressure was immense. I needed 2 cases of frozen lobster tails for a bisque that was a signature dish. "Jacques, I'm hitting the freezer," I yelled to my head chef, who was sweating over a line of sizzling pans. "Lobster for the bisque." He waved a hand, too preoccupied to respond. I pushed through the heavy door, the rush of frozen air a welcome relief from the galley's inferno. The door swung shut behind me with a solid, final thump. The silence was immediate, the chaos of the galley reduced to a distant, muffled throb. The cold was a physical shock, as it always was, My breath plumed in thick white clouds. I navigated the narrow aisles, my boots squeaking on the frosted floor. The lobster was at the very back, behind a pallet of frozen vegetables. I had to move a few boxes to get to it. It took me a few minutes, my fingers growing numb even through my gloves. Finally, I hefted the 2 heavy cases and turned to leave. I walked back to the door, set one case down, and reached for the long metal handle. I pushed. It didn't move. I frowned, setting the other case down. I put both hands on the handle and threw my weight against it. Nothing. It was locked. A trickle of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. It's just stuck, I told myself. The seal is frozen. It happens. I slammed my shoulder against the door. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice flat and dead in the thick frozen air. "Hey! The door's stuck. I'm in here." There was no response. The muffled throb of the galley continued, unchanged. They couldn't hear me. No one could hear me. The realization began to dawn, cold and heavy in my gut. I was trapped in a 20-degree Celsius freezer. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, panic, sharp and primal, started to claw its way up my throat. I began to pound on the door with my fists, the impact's dull thuds against the thick insulation. "Help! Someone! I'm locked in!" My shouts were swallowed by the endless humming cold. I was screaming into a void. I fumbled for my radio, clipped to my hip. I pressed the transmit button. "Galley, this is Antonio. I'm locked in the main freezer. Does anyone copy?" Only static hissed back. The thick steel walls and the dense insulation were a perfect Faraday cage. No signal could get in or out. This was it. This was how I was going to die. Not in some dramatic kitchen fire, but frozen solid, surrounded by sides of beef, forgotten in a steel box. The thought was so absurd, so terrifying, that I sank to my knees, my breath coming in ragged white gasps. The cold was already seeping deeper through my clothes into my muscles. I could feel it in my bones. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the compressor cycling or the ship groaning. But it was different. It was a sound within the room, a soft, melodic humming. I froze, my panic momentarily eclipsed by a new, deeper fear. I wasn't alone. The humming was a woman's voice. It was a lullaby, something old and familiar, but the tune was distorted, stretched thin by the cold. It was coming from deep within the forest of frozen racks, from the far corner where we stored the long-term supplies, the bulk flour, the emergency rations. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a listening silence. Then a voice spoke. It was clear, crisp, and unnervingly close, as if someone were standing right behind me. It was the same voice that had been humming, but now it was devoid of all melody. It was a flat, dead sound. "Shh," it whispered. "It's quieter now." Every hair on my body stood on end. I scrambled backward, away from the voice, my back hitting a rack of frozen turkeys. I stared into the maze of shelves, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. There was nothing there. Just frost and frozen food. "Who's there?" I screamed, my terror giving my voice a strength it didn't have before. The humming started again, this time from a different direction, from my left. It was closer. I could feel a presence, a spot of intense cold moving through the aisles. I could hear the faintest crunch of frost under a non-existent footstep. It was playing with me. The horror of my situation redoubled. I wasn't just going to freeze to death. I was going to be tormented by something in the dark until I did. The cold was no longer just a physical threat. It felt sentient, malevolent. I lost all sense of time, of professionalism, of pride. I became an animal, driven purely by the need to escape. I threw myself at the door again, pounding, kicking, screaming until my throat was raw. I used the corner of a lobster case to try and pry at the seal, but it was useless. My hands were going numb, my movements becoming sluggish. The cold was winning. This is it, I thought, my mind beginning to fog. This is how it ends. In the quiet. Just as my vision began to tunnel, as I started to accept the icy embrace, I heard a new sound. A voice, muffled but real, from the other side of the door. "Check the freezer. Antonio's gone missing." It was Jacques. With the last of my strength, I slammed my body against the door and let out a guttural, desperate roar. "I'm in here! Jacques, open the door!" A moment of silence, then the sound of the external handle being worked. A clunk. The door swung open, flooding the freezer with a wave of blessedly warm, noisy air from the galley. I stumbled out, collapsing into Jacques' arms. I was shaking uncontrollably, my lips blue, my skin pale. Mon Dieu, Antonio, what happened? The door wasn't locked, the handle was just stiff. I couldn't form words, I just pointed a trembling finger back into the freezing darkness. In there. Jacques peered in, then looked back at me with a mixture of pity and concern. "There's no one in there, my friend. You were alone. You panicked. It happens. The cold, it messes with your head." They wrapped me in blankets and sat me in the chef's office. The official report said I'd suffered a severe panic attack brought on by claustrophobia and mild hypothermia. The door mechanism was inspected and lubricated. But I know what I heard. That voice. That humming. That whispered, "It's quieter now." I finished that voyage, but I was a ghost in my own kitchen. I never entered that freezer alone again. I quit a month later. I work in a small, open-plan bistro in Nice now, where the sun is always warm and the only cold storage is a glass-fronted display. But sometimes when I open a commercial fridge and feel that rush of cold air, I freeze. Just for a second. And I hear it. The faint echo of a lullaby, a reminder that in the deepest cold and the deepest silence, you are never truly alone. And that some things prefer it that way. My wife Jenna and I are budget travelers. The glossy brochures of balcony suites and ocean views were never for us. We wanted to see the world, and if that meant spending 10 days in a windowless interior room on the Aegean Spirit, so be it. "We'll only be in there to sleep," we told each other, laughing. Cabin 9121 was our economical cocoon, a queen bed, a tiny bathroom, and walls so close you could high-five them both at once. The first thing I noticed was the vent. Above the bed, set into the low ceiling, was a large, brushed metal grill for the ship's air circulation. It was bigger than any vent I'd seen, a dark, square mouth that seemed to swallow the dim light from the bedside lamps. The first night I was woken by a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic, shuffling sound. Not a click or a clank, not the groan of the ship. This was organic. It sounded like something dry and leathery being slowly, deliberately dragged through a metal duct. Shuffle, drag, shuffle, drag. It would start, continue for exactly 30 seconds, then stop for a few minutes, then it would start again. The pattern was unnervingly precise. "Jenna," I whispered, shaking her gently. "Do you hear that?" She mumbled, half asleep. "Hear what?" "The ship. Go back to sleep, Liam." I lay there in the absolute blackness, listening. Shuffle, drag, shuffle, drag. It was directly above my head. I told myself it was the sound of the ship flexing, of cables moving within their housings. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, over watery coffee in the buffet, I mentioned it to Jenna. "That weird noise last night sounded like something in the vent." She shrugged. "I didn't hear anything. You're a light sleeper. It's probably just the air conditioning." But it wasn't. It happened again the second night. And the third. The same pattern. The same slow, dragging shuffle. It became the soundtrack to my nights, a metronome of dread counting down the minutes until dawn. Jenna, a deep sleeper, heard nothing. I started wearing earplugs, but the sound was low frequency, a vibration I could feel through the pillow as much as hear. It felt intentional. By the fifth night, I was a wreck. Dark circles hung under my eyes. I jumped at sudden noises. The cheerful atmosphere of the ship felt like a cruel joke. Our floating hotel had a rodent in the walls, and I was the only one who knew. On the sixth night, I'd had enough. The rational explanations were exhausted. It wasn't the AC, it wasn't the ship, it wasn't my imagination. There was something in the ventilation system. The shuffling started right on schedule just after 2 a.m. Jenna was sound asleep beside me. This was it. I moved silently, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I climbed onto the bed, standing on the mattress directly under the vent. The metal grill was cold against my forehead. The shuffling was louder here, clearer. Shuffle, drag. I took out my phone, opened the flashlight app, and took a deep breath. This would prove it. I'd see a nest, a forgotten tool bag, something. I would shine the light, see the mundane cause, and finally get a full night's sleep. I pointed the bright LED beam up through the slats of the grill. The shuffling stopped instantly. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the sound had been. I held my breath, the phone beam shaking in my hand. The vent was a black cavity, a maze of dark, dusty ducts stretching into infinity. I saw nothing, no nest, no bag, just darkness. And then something moved. From the deep shadows at the back of the duct, something shifted. A shape detached itself from the darkness and slid forward into the edge of my light. It was a single bloodshot eye. It was too large. It wasn't a rat's eye. It was a human eye, but wrong. The white was a web of burst capillaries, a map of crimson on a field of sickly yellow. The pupil was a wide, black pit, dilated in the sudden light. It was unblinking, and it was looking directly at me. It wasn't an eye of curiosity or fear. It was an eye of recognition. A choked sound died in my throat. I stumbled backward, falling off the bed and onto the floor with a thud. The phone clattered away, plunging the room back into darkness. Jana jolted awake. "Liam, what was that? Are you okay?" I couldn't speak. I scrambled on the floor, grabbing for the phone, my entire body trembling. I pointed the beam back at the vent. It was empty. Just a dark, metal grate. We got a full refund. Not because the cruise line believed us, but because I made such a scene at the purser's desk the next morning, sleep-deprived and hysterical, that they paid us off to avoid a lawsuit. The official diagnosis was acute sleep deprivation leading to a hypnopompic hallucination. But I know what I saw. I didn't imagine the weeks of shuffling. I didn't imagine that eye. We never took another cruise. We stick to road trips now, in a small camper van where I can see the sky, and the walls don't have secrets. But sometimes, when the heating system in our house kicks on, and the ducts expand with a soft pop, I freeze, just for a second. And I remember the shuffle in the vent, and the feeling of something that lived in the walls of that floating city, something that knew I was listening, and decided to look back. My name is Liam, and for 5 years I've been a part of the hotel staff aboard the Solaris Queen. My world is one of crisp linens, polished silver, and the quiet hum of satisfied guests. I know the rhythm of a voyage like I know my own heartbeat. And part of that rhythm, as unchanging as the tides, is the mandatory muster drill before we even leave port. It's a scripted affair. The blaring alarm, the cheerful but firm announcements, the slow, shuffling river of passengers in their oversized life jackets heading to their assigned stations. My station was Lifeboat 13 on the starboard side. My job was to stand by, check off names on a clipboard, and project an air of calm competence. It was administrative, boring, and I'd done it 24 times. But this time, during the drill in Southampton, something was off. I was running through the passenger manifest on my tablet, cross-referencing it with the physical list on my clipboard. My eyes scanned the list for Lifeboat 13, and there it was, halfway down. A name I didn't recognize. Eleanor Vance. The field for her stateroom number was blank. The assignment was listed as permanent. A glitch. It had to be. The IT systems on these ships are a patchwork of old and new, a ghost in the machine, a name from a previous voyage that never got purged. I made a mental note to report it to the purser's office after the drill and thought nothing more of it. The drill proceeded. The sun was bright, the air crisp. Passengers joked and took selfies, treating the whole thing as a photo opportunity. I did my duty, ticking off names, directing people. As the crowd around my boat thinned, I saw her. An old woman standing apart from the others, near the railing. She was dressed not in a garish orange life jacket, but in a beautiful, anachronistic white lace dress that looked like it belonged in a vintage photograph. The wind tugged at the delicate fabric and her long silver hair. She was staring out at the sea, her posture straight, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. She was serene, eerily so. While everyone else was fumbling and chatting, she was perfectly still, a statue of quiet dignity, a forgotten passenger, someone who'd wandered from her station. The drill concluded. The all clear sounded. The crowd began to disperse, laughing and heading back to the bars and pools. I finished my final checks and prepared to secure the area. As I turned, I glanced back towards the railing. The woman was gone. A faint prickle of unease ran up my neck. I scanned the deck. It was emptying quickly. There was no sign of a woman in a white lace dress. She couldn't have just vanished. Shaking off the feeling, I headed inside. The rest of the day was a blur of embarkation chaos. But the image of the woman, and that name on the list, lingered in the back of my mind like a stubborn ghost. That night, I couldn't sleep. My shift had ended, but a restless energy kept me awake. I decided to go up on deck for some air, to watch the lights of the English coastline fade into the darkness. I found myself walking, almost without thinking, towards the starboard side, towards Lifeboat 13. The deck was deserted, the pools covered, the chairs stacked. The only light came from the moon and the running lights of the ship. As I approached Lifeboat 13, my steps slowed. She was there, the woman in white. She was inside the covered lifeboat. I could see her silhouette through the clear plastic of the cover, sitting perfectly upright on one of the hard benches, her hands still clasped in her lap. She was staring out at the black water, just as she had been during the drill. My blood ran cold. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. The lifeboats are sealed, their safety equipment. No one, especially not a passenger, should be inside one. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice unsteady. "Ma'am, you can't be in there. The drill is over." The silhouette didn't move, didn't turn. It was as if she couldn't hear me. I took a step closer, my heart beginning to hammer. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Slowly, so slowly, the figure turned its head. Through the murky plastic, I couldn't make out her features, but I felt her gaze upon me. It wasn't a look of confusion or surprise. It was a look of profound, bottomless sorrow. And then, she began to fade. It wasn't like someone walking away. It was like a photograph dissolving in developing fluid. The white lace dress, the silver hair, the silhouette. They all lost their solidity, becoming transparent, merging with the darkness inside the lifeboat until there was nothing left. Nothing but an empty bench. I stood there, frozen, the cold night air suddenly feeling arctic. I stumbled back to the crew quarters, my mind reeling. The next morning I went straight to the ship's archives, a small dusty room in the bowels of the vessel. I had to know. It took me hours, sifting through old logs and passenger manifests on microfiche. And then I found it, in the ship's maiden voyage log, from over 50 years ago. A society page from an old newspaper reporting on the launch. There was a photo of a beautiful young socialite named Eleanor Vance, celebrated for her elegance, known for her lavish white lace gowns. The article ended with a brief, tragic footnote. On the third night of that maiden voyage, heartbroken over a failed engagement, Eleanor Vance had climbed over the railing near Lifeboat 13 and vanished into the sea. They never recovered her body. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? But I understood then. The name on the manifest wasn't a glitch, it was a permanent assignment. Eleanor Vance never truly left the Solaris Queen. She was still waiting for her lifeboat to be launched, forever bound to the vessel that carried her to her death. A permanent, sorrowful passenger on a journey that never ends. And sometimes, on quiet nights, she still takes her seat, waiting for a rescue that will never come. My wife, Clara, and I were on our honeymoon. The Starlight Mariner was our palace for 10 days, a promise of sunrise over Santorini and moonlit waters in the Adriatic. We'd splurged on a suite with a private balcony, but a last-minute plumbing issue saw us upgraded to a stateroom on a lower deck, one famed for its massive original brass portholes. The room was smaller, but the porthole was a masterpiece. A thick, beveled glass eye, nearly 3 feet across, set in polished, aged brass. At night, it became a living painting, framing the moonlit sea in a perfect, rippling circle. It was our third night. The sea was calm, a vast black silk sheet under a sky dusted with infinite stars. We lay in bed, propped up on pillows, watching the hypnotic dance of moonlight on water through that magnificent window. The room was dark, the only light coming from that celestial display. "It's like we're the only 2 people in the world," Clara whispered, her head on my shoulder. I squeezed her hand. "We are." We lay in comfortable silence for a long time, the gentle rock of the ship lulling us. I was on the verge of sleep when I felt Clara tense beside me. "David," she whispered, her voice tight, "there's someone on our balcony." A jolt of adrenaline chased the sleep from my mind. "What? That's not possible." Our room didn't have a balcony. It had a porthole. "Look," she insisted, her voice trembling. She pointed at the glass. I followed her gaze. At first I saw only the reflection of our dark room, superimposed on the moonlit sea. But then I saw it. A shape. A humanoid shape, pressed against the outside of the glass. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. We were on deck 4. The sea was a good 30 feet below us. There was no ledge, no maintenance platform, nothing. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Clara's grip on my arm was vice-like. The shape became clearer as my eyes adjusted. It was a face, a man's face. But it was wrong, terribly wrong. It was waterlogged and bloated, the skin a pale, ghastly white, tinged with green. Strands of dark, slimy seaweed were tangled in the hair that floated around its head like a grotesque halo. But the worst part was the eyes. They were open, but the pupils were milked over, a cataract white that seemed to see nothing and everything at once. It wasn't trying to get in. It wasn't pounding on the glass or scratching at it. It was just watching us. Its head was tilted at a slight angle, as if studying specimens in a tank. "David." Clara's whisper was a strangled sob. I was frozen, a statue of terror. This wasn't a hallucination. We were both seeing it. The details were horrifyingly crisp in the moonlight. I could see the texture of its waterlogged skin, the way the seaweed moved with the gentle sway of the ship. I could see the slow, deliberate blink of its milky eyes. Then it moved. With a languid, fluid motion that was utterly alien, it slowly raised a hand from the darkness below and placed its palm flat against the outside of the glass. The hand was as bloated and pale as the face, the fingers slightly splayed. Water streamed from its wrist in tiny rivulets. That single silent gesture broke the spell of our paralysis. Clara screamed, a raw, piercing sound that shattered the peace of our room. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the bedside lamp, my own cry of terror caught in my throat. My hand slapped against the switch, and the room was suddenly, brutally flooded with warm, electric light. We both stared, panting at the porthole. It was empty. The glass was clear, showing nothing but the peaceful, star-dusted night and the gentle swell of the Black Sea. There was no face, no hand, no seaweed. We spent the rest of the night huddled together on the far side of the room, all the lights on, staring at that porthole as if it were the gateway to hell. We reported it to the ship's security at first light. 2 officers came, their faces a mask of professional skepticism. They examined the porthole, checked the hull schematics, and assured us it was a physical impossibility for anyone to be outside our window. The mind can play tricks in the dark, especially at sea, the senior officer said, his tone condescending. You likely saw a trick of the moonlight on the waves, a reflection. It's a common phenomenon. A reflection with seaweed in its hair, Clara shot back, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. He gave us a tight smile. The power of suggestion is strong. You're in a new environment. It's easy to misinterpret what you see. They left, and we were alone again with the porthole. We demanded to be moved, but the ship was full. We were trapped in that room. For the remaining 7 days of our honeymoon, we lived in a state of low-grade terror. We taped a blanket over the porthole, but it felt like a pathetic defense. Every time we entered the room, our eyes were drawn to that covered circle of glass. Every night we slept fitfully, starting at every sound, convinced we would see that bloated, pale hand pulling the blanket aside. The magic was gone. The romantic dinners, the exotic ports, the stunning sunsets. All of it was tainted by the memory of that thing in the window. Our honeymoon, the trip of a lifetime, had become a waking nightmare. We never got an apology from the cruise line. The official stance remained that we had experienced a shared waking dream or a mass hallucination triggered by fatigue. But we know what we saw. We saw it together. We have the same horrific image burned into our memories. The waterlogged face, the milky eyes, the seaweed, the hand placed against the glass. We have photos from that trip. In them, we're smiling, but the smiles don't reach our eyes. There's a shadow there, a distance. We look like people who have seen a crack in the world, a glimpse of something that should never be seen. We never took another cruise. We can't even live in a house with a basement because the feeling of something being just on the other side of a barrier is too much to bear. That porthole taught us a terrible truth about the sea. It's not empty. It's a graveyard. And sometimes the occupants get curious. Sometimes they look in. They found my cruise card on the deck near the railing, but they never found what I saw that night in the reflection of my stateroom window. And God help me, I pray they never do. These are the stories they don't put in the brochures. The whispers in the engine room, the faces in the portholes, the ghosts of voyages past. The ocean is old and deep, and it seems some ships carry more than just passengers. If you have your own story from the high seas, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. Thank you for sailing with us tonight on Night Souls. Stay curious, but maybe keep your feet on dry land for a while. Good night.